new participants have slowed down a little bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon. I'm Meg Howard. I'm a program director at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, focused on building decarbonization. And I'm going to be joined today by Mike Ostagai from Abode, as well as Grant Gunnison from Zero. And together we're going to be sharing what we've been working on in a pilot that we're gearing up to launch the infield portion in the spring, and hoping to take this opportunity to share what we have so far and hopefully get some great feedback from all of you on the panel today and answer any questions you have. So our pilot, as our title suggests here, is focused on home decarbonization. I am going to start today by just talking a little bit about why we're doing this pilot, give an overview of the pilot, then we'll get into some details around the scope of what a decarbonization assessment looks like, what support services are going to look like for this pilot, talk through the software approach we're taking, give a little preview of the homeowner report and plan that a participant might end up with, and then just conclude with some pilot goals and outcomes. We would encourage you all to ask questions in the chat. We'll try and answer them as we go, maybe save some for discussion at the end, and then we should have some time at the end to answer questions, either discussion in the chat, or maybe we can, I think you all at that point will be able to unmute and ask questions verbally if you prefer. So yeah, so I'm going to dive in, but like I said, please do ask your question in the chat as we go along. So a little bit about, my organization, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Many of you may be familiar with us, but if you're not, we are a quasi-state agency that is one tool of our state to achieve our net zero 2050 greenhouse gas goals, and we're really focused on doing that through supporting innovation, as well as testing different market solutions and building the workforce. Within the broad scope of greenhouse gas reductions, we have 4 focus areas: high performance buildings, which is where this pilot is sitting. Our organization also works on clean transportation, net zero grid, and offshore wind, sort of undergirded by cross-cutting measures on workforce, technology development, and some investments that we make. So like I said, this pilot sits within our buildings work, which is a core focus area of Mass CECs because it represents 27% of our state's greenhouse gas emissions. Varies a little bit state to state, but pretty similar for others in the region. And when that 27% is just talking about fossil fuels that are burned on site for heating and hot water in buildings, we're not looking at electricity. That's sort of a separate, we account for that separately. So that 27%, over a quarter is just, heating and hot water in buildings. So if we're trying to get to a net zero goal by 2050, a 50% reduction goal by 2030, buildings are obviously a huge piece of that pie, and it's a pretty daunting challenge with over 2.5 million buildings in Massachusetts, many X that in terms of number of appliances. There's just millions and millions of decisions that need to happen between now and 2050 with millions of decision makers. And this is also an area that, people in the Commonwealth are spending a good bit of money on. Average energy spending in the Commonwealth is $2,500 a year. So it's already, a fairly major household expense. And so definitely something we're keeping in mind as we think about transitioning. I think at this point in our state policy discussions, we're goal of eliminating emissions from the building sector by 2050, while keeping in mind our state's economic development and keeping in mind that we're fostering a just transition that's not going to leave residents of the Commonwealth behind. So I think the sort of big picture of that is starting to come together for us, and it will, for buildings, will involve, getting as much energy efficiency as we possibly can. So sort of deep weatherization of existing buildings, and new buildings, obviously, transitioning end uses in the building, like heating and hot water and appliances, to electric, and then at the same time cleaning up the electric grid. But what that actually looks like in a building is, sort of simple to say that high-level formula, but the, nuts and bolts and knobs and tubes and heat pumps are all pretty complicated questions. I know as a, homeowner myself, even being deeply immersed in this professionally, sort of trying to do some of these things for my own home is pretty daunting, or I run into new challenges I didn't expect. So the goal of our pilot is really to start to lay out a path for how to transition some of the millions of buildings to a decarbonized future. This pilot is really focused on low-rise residential. That's mostly single family in our state, but some other small multifamily as well. Mass EC has other pilots specifically around triple deckers and larger multifamily and commercial building typologies. This pilot we're talking about today is really just focused on small residential buildings, largely single family. And what we want to do is create and demonstrate a cost-effective model for how to eliminate emissions in homes over time. The budget for the pilot is up to $2 million. We have $1 million sort of for this first cohort, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then hopefully a second $1 million for another cohort. So, like I said, we want to develop and test a home decarbonization assessment. That will mean coming up with, what are the recommendations based on the currently best available technologies and practices, and then what does it look like to create a transition plan for a homeowner. We're hoping to pilot that with 75 homes. The first cohort we think will be about 30 homes, somewhere in the 20 to 40 range. And then, like I said, assuming that goes well, we'll gear up for a second cohort to kind of build on the lessons of the first cohort. And we will be offering participants increased incentives above baseline mass save incentives or any other incentives they may be eligible for, to help ease that transition and hopefully see some results kind of skewed towards the earlier end to deepen our learnings from the pilot and put out some consumer-facing resources and case studies at the end of it. So just some timeline of the pilot so far. This past, I guess really spring of 21, we asked for a lead technical consultant. The end of July, we contracted with Abode Energy Management, who Mike works for, and we'll be talking more about their role. And that was really to do some of the front end work of developing what does this look like to do a decarbonization assessment in a home and to kind of set up a homeowner to plan to decarbonize their home. So that's what we have been working on since then. We are currently have an active RFP open looking for someone to be more of the implementer. We're calling that role the Home Decarbonization Advisor, so to be the actual person. Now that Abode has created the protocols, which Mike will talk more about, of what it looks like to go into a home and have this conversation, we're looking for a vendor to be the one to do that, and hoping that we can bring that person on board so that this spring we're actually picking the first cohort and doing the assessments with them. Because it's sort of a pilot, we have a limited time frame. We're going to offer them incentives for any actions they take within the first year of that assessment, and then plan to do some follow-up outreach and hopefully bill analysis for 2 years after that. And like I said, hopefully we'll launch this spring with cohort 1. If everything goes great, maybe by summer or fall, we'll be following with a second cohort. So you'll hear from Mike directly in a moment, but I just wanted to kind of introduce that Abode also brought on a pretty comprehensive team that's working with them. So you'll also hear from Grant from Zero, who's providing the software solutions, but Abode has a number of other team members, including a behavioral science group, Ideas 42, and a group in color working on diversity, equity, inclusion in our pilot. So this is the Abode team. Additionally, we have a volunteer review committee who has been giving us some feedback on the initial design up to this point. Hopefully we'll get some more feedback from all of you today, but these are some organizations that have been acting as a review committee, which we are deeply grateful for. So as we get closer to selecting the first 30 homes, I wanted to share what we're currently thinking, which is that we want to target households that are planning to replace their heating system within the next year and interested in heat pumps. Ideally, we're probably thinking for candidates that want to do a whole home heat pump, although we probably won't exclusively limit to that. So this might screen out participants who already have a heat pump, because I think, at least for this first cohort, we're really interested in helping coach through that transition. What I've seen from previous work that we've done at Mass CEC is a particularly difficult part of the overall home decarbonization transition. We will be doing some targeted outreach to environmental justice communities, probably reserving around 10 of the 30 spots for those targeted communities to make sure that we're having a diverse cohort of participants. I think we'll also be looking for diversity of location, diversity of building stock in terms of existing heating fuel, distribution type, if there's ducts or radiators in the home. Participants can be statewide. They just have to pay into Mass CEC's funding source. So there are some municipal utilities that don't and some that do, but all the investor-owned utilities do. And then, like I said, hopefully we'll gear up for another cohort of maybe another 45 homes. And this is our draft of currently what we think we'd offer to participants in terms of additional incentives. It would be based on the household income. So this SMI stands for state median income. So for households that had less than 80% of state median income, the incentive could go up to $30,000. For households that had 80 to 120%, the incentive could be $20,000, and then for households above 120%, incentive could be up to $10,000. And there would be different sub caps under that of how much the money could be used towards different components of home decarbonization. And I guess, hopefully the rest of this table speaks for itself, although it is somewhat complicated, I realize. But the one thing I did want to note is that we're not necessarily proposing this as an incentive design that would scale. I think a lot of the stuff Mike's going to talk about in terms of what the actual decarbonization assessment looks like, certainly what Grant's going to talk about in terms of what his software can do, we're hoping will be scalable, or at least, could be iterated, or, pieces of it could be used in other efforts to do home decarbonization. This incentive structure is really sort of governed by the short-term nature of a one-year pilot, so not necessarily something we're proposing to scale, although we certainly want it to work well for our pilot. So I think I'll pause here and hand things over to Mike to start giving you some more details about the actual assessment itself and supporting services.
Great, thanks, Meg. So I'm going to start with kind of what's a standard energy assessment, and then the next slide we'll get into what we're layering on to make this a decarbonization assessment. And like Meg was saying, we're kind of focused on the scalability of this and pairing it with a mass save assessment in the pilot. There is, in other states and other areas, you could do this differently, but in this pilot, most of the focus is on how do we kind of bolt this on to the mass save process. And so this is kind of a simplified version of what could be included in a standard assessment, like a mass save visit. And so I'll just walk through, starting on the left-hand side. The basic experiences, there's a kind of an intro and a goal setting that's fairly quick. And then the energy specialist kind of goes into the visual inspections and testing steps of the process, they're mostly focused around health and safety and making sure that the home is in a condition that can be weatherized, that can be improved. And so it's really, the testing and things like that are to determine that kind of health and safety level and roadblock level. The center column, the data collection for a mass save visit is fairly simple, where you're getting information about the actual work scope mostly, and some information about the home. And that's all feeding into a simple energy model that generates savings for the customer and a report. And again, it's all focused around kind of what Mass Save focuses on and offers, which is, weatherization and equipment rebates and things like that. So the scope's fairly limited and straightforward. And then kind of at the end of the process, you sit down with the customer and you say, this is what I found, here's your report, let's get you scheduled for weatherization, and the customer is ready to go. And so kind of keep that in mind as your baseline. And if we go to the next slide, Meg. So this is layering on the decarbonization components to that process. And so just to orient everybody, because there's a lot going on here, the blue check boxes are everything you would do at a decarbonization assessment. And the green check boxes are what you would do at a kind of standard mass save assessment. Any of the blue text is just an additional step or element to kind of what you do at a standard assessment. So kind of going back to the beginning of the process, if we're going out for a decarbonization assessment, kind of the scope of what the customer can do is much bigger. There's more opportunity, which means there's more expense. And so there's a lot more to think about, which is why we want to layer on a little bit deeper overview conversation about the customer goals and priorities and budget, because that's really going to guide what happens kind of in the following steps. And then you move into the visual inspection piece of the process, and the first thing that's kind of being layered on is a little more comprehensive look at ventilation for the home. And so there's more of a focus on spot ventilation at kitchens and bathrooms, but also whole home ventilation, and just making sure, determining where the home is currently and where they will end up after decarbonization, and kind of what their ventilation needs will be in both situations. There is a little bit of added work around health and indoor air quality related to some of the health and safety visual inspections that happen. There's also a kind of a quick electrical evaluation, since much of the focus here is electrifying buildings. And so we need to have a good sense of where they're starting at, what does their electric panel look like, what do they need to upgrade. And then the last checkbox there in visual inspection is resiliency. And that is really, again, kind of making sure that a customer is going to put in all this effort and expense into decarbonizing, that they're also taking resiliency into account, and hopefully we can make some good recommendations there. So that brings you into the testing phase, where on top of combustion safety testing that's already done, blower door testing will be added to this visit. And blower door testing is helpful just to get a better sense of the kind of air leakage in a building, but it also ties back to that ventilation component and figuring out how much ventilation a home needs. And so then moving to the center column, so starting a data collection, there's the mass save component, and then there's what we need to basically generate savings estimates and CO2 reduction estimates for everything else. And so that's where the software that we're using, Zero, comes into play, and Grant's going to talk a bit more about what that entails. But there is the Zero software will encompass all recommendations, and Mass Save software will be used just for the kind of specific Mass Save component. So below data collection is a new box called Opportunity Assessment. And essentially what this is, it's a tool, or kind of basically a tool built into Zero that takes into account the customer's kind of goals and priorities and what they've done and what they plan to do. And then all of the possible recommendations you could make, which for decarbonization, the list gets pretty long. And so it's a lot for the advisor in the home to think about 50 or 60 different things. And so this is meant to structure that a little bit, give them a tool so they can kind of basically make sure the home, or everything that can be recommended for the home is recommended. And ideally results in a more consistent experience for customers. So moving to the modeling and analysis, kind of covered that, but basically there's the two different tools we're using. There's the Mass Save software, and then there's Zero on top of that, which is Zero is the primary kind of decarbonization tool here. And then the last step in the middle column is also a new step. This is a check-in conversation with the customer. So essentially, you're just taking everything you learn from that, the overview conversation with the customer, all your inspections, the data collection, the opportunity assessment. You're all kind of rolling that up into a quick check-in with the customer to say, hey, this is what I found. This is what opportunity exists. This is maybe a roadblock that you have to address before you weatherize your home or before you kind of go deeper in some area. And so it's meant to be kind of that check-in to say, all right, let's make sure the plan I'm thinking about is the right plan for the customer. And then that feeds into that third column, where it says planning tool, where you're actually taking what you just discussed and putting it into Zero to generate a decarbonization plan. And this is, assigning different projects to multi-year plans, since this, the average customer may not be able to do this to decarbonize their home fully, all in year one. And so you have to kind of build out a plan that covers multiple years. And so the planning tool is another component that's being built in to the software. And then the last step in the home is this kitchen table conversation, where you again talk through the Mass Save component, schedule the weatherization, and then you sit down and you really go through the decarbonization plan. And the one thing that, or the last thing on the list where it says support hub, that's actually a post-assessment process, which is on the next slide I'll go into. But the idea is that at the end of this kitchen table conversation, we want the customer to know, great, we gave you a starting point, we gave you a plan, but we're going to support you kind of through the process. The real complexity comes after the visit, when you really start diving into the details and working with contractors and trying to figure out what goes when in terms of the process. So that's where the support hub comes into play, and the customer would know that they have that as a resource. So I'll run through that. If you can go to the next slide, Meg. Thank you. So another busy slide here, but starting in the middle, there are three components to this. So there are support services, resources, and a contractor network. And so support services point to an energy generalist, but think of it as someone who is just an expert in all these different categories of energy efficiency and decarbonization. So they're HVAC and hot water and renewables. They can help you kind of through all of that. And the idea is the customer would schedule a time when they're ready to start taking action on some of these projects that were recommended. And they'll have a conversation with this energy generalist and talk through, what should I ask contractors? Or maybe they've had contractors out and they can review quotes, or they just want to know, what projects should they focus on next. And so that's what that person is there for. And that person actually could be the same specialist or same advisor who came to your house, or it could be a different person, but they'll have the same level of knowledge and they'll have all the information that was collected in your home. And so it should be a pretty seamless transition from the in-home assessment to these follow-up support services. On the right-hand side, the resources circle there in purple. It's basically kind of a central location for everything a customer in the pilot should need. And so there's, pilot documents and rebate documents. There are educational resources and ways to schedule your support services, or an online scheduling tool, and even places to upload usage data 6 months from now, once you've started decarbonizing and you want to track kind of what's been, or how things are going. And so that'll be the resource component of it. And then the last part of the support hub is the contractor network. And it's split up into two categories, where there's there are situations where we need to provide less guidance finding contractors and situations where we want to provide more guidance finding contractors. And so on the less guidance side of things, if a customer is going out to find a massive contractor or PV or solar thermal, in general, they're going to get what kind of aligns with their decarbonization goals. They will get PV and massive insulation, and they will get something that is aligned with decarbonization. The contractors on the the left-hand side in blue, where there's more guidance needed, those are kind of what we feel like are critical contractors in the process that could guide a customer down a different path, or could sell against decarbonization or kind of point them away from it. And so that's not a great experience. Obviously, we want customers who go through all this effort to plan to decarbonize, to work with contractors who kind of understand their goals and can align what they're selling with that. And so HVAC is a big one. You want, heat pumps, as Meg said, are complicated, and you want contractors that are aligned with kind of selling heat pumps for this purpose, for decarbonization. And then into that is hot water and ventilation and all the other things that are as important, but also complicated systems in a home. And so we really want good contractors in that kind of vetted group. General contractors are in here because they can provide a huge amount of value for a customer if it makes sense for their project and financially it makes sense. But you do need a general contractor who is also aligned with kind of decarbonization goals and understands the strategies. And then exteriors rolls up kind of roofing and siding and windows and insulation, all these things. But really like that, it's the same kind of thing. If you can find a good exterior contractor who again is aligned with these pilot goals, the customer goals, it'll make the process a lot smoother, a lot easier for the customer. And so really that's what we're trying to do is just reduce that burden on the customer to be their own GC and kind of manage their way through the marketplace. We want to guide them with actual support services, with actual contractors that are aligned with this, and then with the resources that they need. Next slide. All right, so that's kind of the quick overview of where things are in the process. In terms of software, actually, if you go to the next slide, that'd be great, Meg. Thank you. We started out, working with the CEC, trying to figure out what's the best approach here, because decarbonization is so new for this type of pilot that there aren't that many tools that are really designed for it. And as we were doing our research, we found a handful of kind of major gaps in what was available versus kind of what we thought we needed. And so, and along the way, we started working with Grant, and he's going to kind of jump in next and kind of go through how the things that we needed are being built in our components of the tools that he's building. So on the first row there, if you go out and look for standard, energy assessment tools and modeling tools, and you try to use them for decarbonization, there will be gaps in what they can calculate and what they can recommend. And that's problematic because you don't want to have too many tools in the field where you have to use one model for 80% and another one for 10%, another one for another 10%. And so really you want a single tool that kind of rolls all the decarbonization and energy efficiency measures into one. The second row is, a challenge in terms of there are, I think, 2 to 3 times as many, depending on what program you're looking at, but there are, I think, 50 or 60 different recommendations on our list for decarbonization. And we did some consolidating and tried to not include every possible thing, but the list is long and it's complicated. And so that's why, as I mentioned before, that opportunity assessment tool is pretty valuable if it's built into the software, because it really does drive the kind of the recommendations for the energy specialist or advisor. It reduces the burden on them to have to think of every possible thing. And it really supports consistency in programs like this, which is a is a major goal for programs like Mass Save and others. The third row is on the reporting side and on the kind of roadmap side of things for customers. The tools that are out there are great at generating kind of a single plan. Here's everything you can do. Generally, it's mostly energy efficiency related, but we couldn't find anything that was good for generating a roadmap and a multi-year plan. And so that's where that planning tool that I mentioned kind of comes into play, where it does actually allow us to map things out further for a customer and really find a way to make this work, since these are expensive projects. When you add everything it takes to decarbonize a typical New England home, it's expensive, or it can be. And so that's where the planning tool and a report designed for decarbonization comes into play. And then the last row here, one of the challenges was rolling up all the different incentives. So in Massachusetts, there's lots of incentives in this program. This pilot is built around taking advantage of what's out there and then layering on Mass CEC's incentives on top of it. And so the tool ideally would pull in state and federal and all the kind of one-off incentives that are available for a customer and put that into their plan. And then at the same time, pull in, somewhat accurate regional costs and cost to actually do these projects, to give the customer a real sense of kind of what they're planning and what they're in for, and what it'll take. And so the tools that are out there are somewhat limited in those two categories. And so that was another area where we thought it could add a lot of value. And so I will hand it to Grant, because that's where, these back and forth, he knows, we've worked closely on all of this, and his tool is checking a lot of these what's needed boxes, which is great.
Hi, folks. My name is Grant. I have a startup over at Greentown. And I guess sort of how we got involved with this, as Mike and the Abode team were searching for a tool to do this, they had to reach out to us, and we were working on many of the core pieces of this. But we're working on something slightly tangential. So we're building sort of a custom version of it specifically for this pilot, as we wanted to help show that there is a better way to get this done. And maybe before I jump into this, there's been a lot of activity in the chat about financing and sort of the zero over time approach. And there are some interesting financing tools that we're actively looking at and hoping to offer to folks in this pilot, but are not currently integrated into our tool. But Zero is looking to integrate those directly into this. So there isn't content in this specific presentation about that, but we certainly recognize that is absolutely a challenge of this, that even incentives can't overcome. And so that is certainly a component that we are looking to integrate here. But as software goes, we could get into the weeds pretty quickly. So I tried to keep this just pretty high level to sort of identify the areas in which we're working in, some of the challenges we're trying to solve. And, happy to follow with folks after if you want to get into the weeds on things. But really the goal is to say that decarbonization, like Mike said, is very complicated. The order in which things happen is important. And you really have to take a much broader perspective and holistically look at the building to be able to help kind of hold people's hand through the process. Because homeowners do really need a lot of help. And that's sort of the focus of the support hub afterwards. So just looking at the opportunity assessment alone, frankly, it's really just a glorified data collection process where we need to go in and address all of the potential opportunities, which means that we need to suck up all of the information about not just what that customer needs and wants to do in their home, but really have an intimate understanding of what that home really looks like, as well as sort of the consumption that they're using in their house today. So I don't know what other tools use. I don't know if Mike and I went and looked at what all the other data inputs look like for other tools, but we're at about 170 data points. We have a pretty intimate understanding of what's going on there. And then we use that information to, again, Mike's point, help the assessor in the process, because there is so much to consider. So we look at customers' interests, wants, existing state of the home to take what is 95 measures, I think, currently in our system, and down selected as much as possible to make it much easier for the assessor to manage that process. And we're looking at opportunities in 4 categories primarily. It's energy efficiency, which is broadly what Mass Save addresses, but also all of the electrification measures, all of the renewable opportunities that may exist, whether it's on-site or off-site, and then sort of an expanded set of health and safety measures as well. And so we do some intelligent selecting and whatnot to sort of push and help the assessor make those decisions more easily. And then once we get that information, we put it into Zero, and we can talk about all the complicated nature of what that looks like. But at the end of the day, it's really about modeling and planning those interventions appropriately so that they're done in the right order, and we can take a look at what the individual impacts look like, as well as all the incentives that are specifically applicable to each of those measures. So we broadly look at incentives, whether it's through Mass Save, this specific program, federal, state, et cetera, to sort of get that picture into people's hands. And specific to this program, we're building what is, I think, a 5-page report currently to help people walk through what they currently have, sort of the stage project order, so they can get a roadmap really to get them to zero emissions. Even some of the replacement planning. So even if they're not as attuned to the decarbonization, they're going to have equipment failures and whatnot. So we need to help them anticipate that. And so we give them an idea of when they are going to have expenditures in the future. And then we get into a pretty set of detailed financials, because at the end of the day, these things are expensive. And dealing with that is certainly sort of a challenge. And so we detail out all the incentives available for the a la carte recommendations, as well as their costs and impacts. And so we kind of have a little bit of a custom version for this pilot, but I think it's going to work pretty well for what the CEC is looking for. And maybe I'll just take 1 second to talk a little bit about hopefully where we can head, which is, our company is really working on automating this process. So hopefully we'll be able to empower homeowners to do this without having to spend huge numbers of hours to get it into everyone's hand. And I'd be happy to talk about that more, but that's sort of outside of the scope of the pilot here. So I think I'll hand it back to Mike and kind of talk through the plan agreement people.
Great, thanks, Grant. All right, so like Grant said, there's a 4 or 5 page report here, and it's a little tough to see. I'll just kind of highlight the main features and the story that we're trying to tell with the report. So on the page 1, this is on the left hand side. This is basically everything the customer can do at a high level, and kind of the impact or benefit from it. And so on the top left, there's a couple of colored circles that are basically, here's your starting point in terms of CO2 for your home and transportation. And then below that is a thermostat that kind of maps out from their starting point, kind of what each one of these multi-year plans, what that actually gets them in terms of CO2 reduction. And so, year 1, it's down 22%, year 2, it's down 40%. And where the goal is to show them that, the path to zero. And on the top right of that first page, or the kind of center right, that's the financial snapshot for year 1. Because this pilot is focused on incentives for that first year and really driving as much action as possible, it doesn't summarize, the total kind of financial snapshot for all the other years. It's really just focused on that first year. And then the house diagram at the bottom is just meant to give customers kind of a visual sense of big categories of opportunity in their home. And if they've already done something like, replace cars with EVs or added solar, those will be checked, and the things that are still on their list will remain unchecked to give them that kind of project list. The page 2 is kind of what Grant was talking about, where it's really saying, like, here's the plan, customer. Here's all of your recommended projects under a year 1 plan, a year 2 through 5 plan, or 5+. And the projects are color coded to the contractors that, or the type of contractor you would need, so that we try to make this as easy as possible, since the average customer may need, 8 or 10 or 12 different contractors. We really want to kind of map things out for them. And then on the left-hand side where it says planning, that's really just kind of connecting the customer with those support services, having conversations, talking to contractors, reviewing what's coming back from contractors, and kind of getting them ready to jump into the actual year 1 projects. The next slide, if you go to that, Meg. So the third page here has 2 parts. So down at the bottom, it's essentially a resource library, which sort of mimics what I talked about on the landing page that has all the different resources. It's the same kind of thing. It gets the customer to that place or directly to something they need. And then the chart at the top is what Grant was referencing in terms of, giving customers a 10-year basically outlook on the equipment they have that is fossil fuel based and when it's expected to hit the end of its useful life, so that they can plan ahead and take action before that happens. Kind of one of the big goals here is to avoid having customers reset the clock by having a water heater die in the middle of the night and being stuck putting in a new fossil fuel based water heater the next day because they don't have any other choice. And so it's that kind of thing we're trying to avoid, is, help them plan ahead for these replacements. And then the last pages, it's really multiple pages, but this is kind of a summary before you get into all the financial details. And this is where the customer can see what each one of these multi-year plans actually costs. And below that, they'd see the individual measures and savings and all the detail for those that want to really get into the weeds. All that will be kind of listed in the report that follows. So that's the kind of the quick version of the report. And as we do these, as the pilot goes on, there will be likely changes and feedback from customers. And so this is expected to evolve as we go, but this is the starting point.
Thanks. So I just wanted to finish up by coming back to the goals and outcomes we're hoping for from this pilot. We, probably first and foremost want to create and test a scalable approach to holistically decarbonizing homes, with the idea that someone, an entity like Mass Save in our state, hopefully could be useful to other states as well, could pick up the pieces of what we're doing and hopefully scale it. So I think, metrics we're looking at for that is, does this approach get people to take action? Is it sort of scalable? Like, we're trying to thread that balance of like enough support and handholding and, smoothing out the process to make things happen without making it so resource intense that it's too expensive to scale. So trying to do it smartly. We're going to collect a lot of data in this pilot. We'll certainly collect data on costs of the measures that are installed. I don't know if it's exactly data, but the best practices and recommendations that we're putting forward in our pilot will definitely be happy to share. And then in terms of performance, there's been some questions about that in the chat. We are looking to do 2 years of bill analysis post pilot and compare to some pre-pilot bill data. So it's not like we're not planning very sophisticated sort of appliance level metering, but that's what we're hoping to do. And would put out a final report with some case studies and lessons learned after like the first year of implementation. And then that follow-up 2 years of bill analysis would be an addendum, that we'd update in the future, but want to get out some initial lessons learned after the initial implementation phase of the pilot. And then finally, we do hope from that final report to turn some of those into case studies and just information and resources that could be used by other homeowners today, who are sort of homeowners, I should say, and landlords and contractors who are willing and able to take action now. So that's it for our overview of the pilot. I'll turn it over to questions. One question that we got in the chat was, how could I be involved in this pilot? So I'll say we haven't opened up the application for participants. That first cohort is just going to be around 30. So I don't know what kind of response we're getting, but I suspect we may not be able to take everyone who's interested. But if you are interested, please email buildings@masscec.com and we'll make sure your email's on the list. As soon as that application opens up, you'll get notified. So we're definitely keeping a list of people who are interested. So if you're interested for your own home or your friends or neighbors or mother-in-law's home, email us there and we'll get on the list. Otherwise, there's been some good questions in the chat. We might kind of work through some of those have been getting answered, but might kind of work through some of those. And then I would also invite people to go ahead and put more questions in the chat or raise your hand. I think you all should be able to do that under reactions. There should be an option to raise hand and we can go ahead and ask the verbal question. But first, let me just skim through some questions in the chat, making sure we've gotten to things there. I saw one question about barriers, often called pre-weatherization barriers or pre-decarbonization barriers in this case. I want to go back to the incentive structure that So first, just to note, as some other people responded, that there are some incentives available from Mass Save to do some barrier mitigation for low-income households, for knob and tube wiring, asbestos, I believe. I don't think there's lead abatement as part of that. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And I feel like there's one more that I'm forgetting. Mike, do you happen to know the existing Mass Save? But
knob and tube, is that the other one you're thinking of? Or
yeah, did I forget to say that? So there are some existing incentives. We also would include barrier mitigation as an eligible expense under this incentive, as long as it's paired with the actual implementation of a measure. So that could be a barrier specific to decarbonization or electrification, I guess, like I need an electric service upgrade. That could be, our incentive could be used towards that as long as you then went forward with at least one electrification measure, like getting a heat pump water heater or something like that. But this category is also meant to cover something like knob and tube or other barriers that might prevent decarbonization. I'm just skimming here. I want to, some questions have been answered. We got some good feedback. Well, a few people chiming in to definitely think about financing. So in Massachusetts, there is the heat loan available, and we're definitely thinking about that. But I think there were some strong votes in the chat to think about options above and beyond that.
Meg, do you want to just touch on the 1-year incentive structure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was definitely some concern of like, well, how is it affordable to do all this in 1 year? And for our pilot, we won't be requiring the people do everything in 1 year, but we sort of, by the nature of a pilot, what we really want to create, as I said at the beginning, is a pathway to decarbonize homes over time, leveraging natural replacement cycles. But we don't have sort of 20 years to run this pilot and see how it goes over the lifetime of equipment in a home. So we want to try and learn as much as we can in 1 year. So our plan is to go in, do this assessment, and this would probably be one in-person visit as part of the pilot, potentially a fairly long one of several hours, where all this data is collected, some of the homeowners' goals are understood, an initial plan is produced in that visit. And then from there'd be some follow-up support phone calls. And we're thinking there might be some back and forth, maybe a period of a couple months while the homeowner actually kind of got their head around what they were hoping to accomplish in year one. At that point, Mass EC would reserve a certain incentive for them. And then anything that they have actually done at the end of year one, would be supported in the pilot. So like I said on this slide, when I first came to it, we're not necessarily proposing that this is a scalable incentive structure, but are sort of constrained to learn as much as we can in a pilot. So I think that's one reason, at least for the cohort one, we are hoping to cherry pick people who are at the point of replacing their heating or cooling system to kind of leverage that transition as part of the pilot. Dave, I don't know if you see other questions that we haven't gotten to. There's definitely some good discussion and feedback here.
Yeah, there's some good chat about deep energy retrofits, and just maybe touch on how this pilot is a decarbonization pilot, not necessarily a deep energy retrofit pilot. There's a lot of overlap in those two, but the goal here is decarbonization, which hopefully includes some continuous insulation on the exterior. But the reality is likely not. Many people are not going to be residing their home in the pilot, and so a lot of good numbers, and it's always helpful to see some estimated costs. But this is definitely decarbonization, not mandatory full deep energy retrofit.
That's a great clarification, especially because at the beginning, when I said what's sort of our state's high level formula, I did say deep weatherization, electrification, and cleaning up the grid. And so I guess to clarify what I meant by that, and this is, something we will explore further in this pilot, is probably at this point we're thinking that doesn't mean, a deep energy retrofit level, or certainly like a passive house retrofit level. For every home, I think I'll speak for myself, my operating hypothesis is that it may mean getting to a slightly more airtight home than, what's sort of a default, what's current practice in terms of, for example, a mass save weatherization today. That's my personal theory, but as Dave said, this is not a deep energy retrofit pilot. So just to reiterate again, that if someone were residing, we would look to leverage that opportunity and see if there was a way to incorporate continuous exterior insulation in their budget. If they were looking to get new windows, we would talk to them about what we recommend, but wouldn't necessarily recommend those measures for every participant in the pilot.
Hi, Meg, Katie from Nessie here. I just wanted to give you and everyone the 5-minute warning. This has been a great presentation. Maybe you have a time for one more quick question.
This is Fred Davis. I'd like to jump in with a question for Meg. I'd like you to, if you could, do whatever extrapolating, looking into a crystal ball, and give us your best guess as to how you might see this ramping up, accelerating, scaling, how quickly, how many, what will it take? Thank you.
I think I'll say I have a foggy crystal ball, just like everyone else. I think the state's sort of best guess in the sand right now is what's in the draft climate and energy report, which is that we would target 1 million homes that are electrified by 2030. This summer, that draft climate report should become a final climate report. So we'll see sort of how that number evolves at that point. So I think, there are something like 2.9 million households in Massachusetts. So to get 1 million of those electrified by 2030 would be a big lift. We're certainly not anywhere on that kind of pace right now, or even really on track to be on that pace. You know, I think that's where we need to go, and we're trying to keep our eye on that goal to hopefully achieve, you know, be able to scale at that rate.
I'll chime in here for 1 second, maybe just talk about sort of our technology pipeline a little bit. As we sort of view a lot of the challenges for homeowners around this planning phase, currently seeing that it takes between 50 and 100 hours for homeowners to sort of get through this process and have the confidence to navigate all of that. And so we're really trying to build the toolkits to make that as easy as possible, and really targeting like a single hour of like human involvement to get people to that point. And so hopefully maybe it's our solution or you know, a variety of solutions that will make it a lot easier for this to happen, and hopefully make it more available, and we can get moving quite a bit more quickly than we're moving today.
All right, I see we're at 4:13, so I'll take one last question I see in the chat about embodied carbon, and then just note, because I do see a lot of good other comments and questions. We are going to have this chat, and so we will do our best to follow up. I think there's some great suggestions that maybe merit some further discussion. So we'll, if you all don't mind, potentially be following up to answer questions or to pick your brain further for feedback. But for a last question, there was a question if there'd be requirements around embodied carbon within the weatherization materials allowed. I think that's something that Mass DEC is increasingly starting to focus on, I guess is an honest way to say it, that we are actually, you know, hopefully later this year, hoping to launch more pilot exclusively focused on that. That was definitely a focus on a recent triple decker design challenge we have. It's on our mind, and we're looking to grow more sophisticated in that area, but I don't think we're at this time planning to have certain weatherization technologies off the table because of embodied carbon. So we're starting to think about it, but definitely still have room to grow. And I mean, I guess maybe just to tie it up, definitely we plan for our work here to be sort of a one step in the journey and a living process, that we're trying to capture what we think is best available recommendations and practices today, with the expectation and frankly hope that those continue to evolve and change. And definitely embodied carbon, I think, is a good area to flag as a place where practices can grow stronger.
Well, that about wraps it up. And I want to thank Meg, Mike, and Grant for a great presentation, a lot of good information. And I'm sure they'll be following up with everyone afterwards. I want to put in a shout out for our happy hour, which is taking place in about 15 minutes. So please join us and we can continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for all the great feedback we've gotten so far. And please do email us at Buildings, and reach out if you want to connect later.